A police officer aimed his gun at a decorated military general in the middle of a funeral, convinced he'd get away with it. What happened next sent shockwaves across the country. The sky was heavy with thick gray clouds, the kind that hung low, pressing down on the world below. The air carried the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass, mixing with the crisp sharpness of polished brass and pressed uniforms. Rows of military personnel stood in formation, their chests stiff with discipline, their faces somber. Civilians clutched small tissues, dabbing at eyes that had long since run dry from days of grief. The funeral was being held at Arlington National Cemetery, a place of reverence and finality, where soldiers were laid to rest with full honors. A casket draped in an American flag sat at the center, surrounded by a carefully arranged formation of servicemen and women. The rhythmic sound of boots against the ground echoed softly as the honor guard prepared for the rifle volley. A final tribute to a life given in service. General Olivia Carter stood near the podium, composed as always. At 57, she carried herself with the presence of someone who had spent a lifetime in command. Every movement was measured, controlled. Navy blue dress uniform, adorned with ribbons and medals, was a silent testament to her decades of service. The streaks of silver in her cropped black hair added an air of authority. She had given her life to the military, serving in combat zones, leading missions, and breaking barriers as one of the highest-ranking black women in the United States Army. She wasn't just here as a superior officer. She was here as a friend to the deceased. Colonel Benjamin Strauss had served under her command for nearly 2 decades. He had been a good soldier, a man of integrity. His sudden death in a training accident had left a hole in the lives of those who knew him. Carter took a steady breath before stepping up to the podium. The microphone crackled slightly, adjusting to her voice as she began. Benjamin Strauss was more than a soldier. He was a husband, a father, a friend. A man who carried the weight of leadership with quiet strength. He was the kind of man who... A shuffle in the crowd. She barely glanced up, but her instincts registered it. A momentary disturbance. A presence moving in the sea of black coats and blue uniforms. She continued speaking, her voice unwavering. Who never asked for recognition but always earned it. He believed in... The movement again, louder this time. Footsteps cutting through the silence. People in the front rows started turning their heads, murmuring. A few officers stiffened, their hands instinctively moving toward their belts. Then, a voice, low, muttered, but audible enough to cut through the still air. She doesn't belong here. General Carter stopped. Just for a second. She let her eyes drift up, scanning the crowd. And that's when she saw him. Officer Daniel Reeves, a police sergeant from Fairfax County, standing a few rows back, his posture rigid. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a black trench coat, his hands buried in his pockets. But his face, flushed, tight with barely contained anger, was unmistakable. She recognized him. Not personally, but by reputation. A name that had come up in circles. A cop with a history of excessive force complaints, the kind that had been buried under technicalities and internal reviews. He was staring right at her. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. And then, just as she was about to continue, he moved. Pushing past mourners, his steps deliberate. Someone tried to place a hand on his arm, but he shook them off. People shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered, their eyes darting between him and the military officers standing near the podium. A single thought ran through Carter's mind. Not here. Not now. But Reeves was still coming. Muttering under his breath, eyes locked onto her like a target. Then, he reached for his waistband. There was a flash of metal. Someone gasped, and in one horrifying second, Daniel Reeves unholstered his gun and pointed it directly at General Olivia Carter. But what happened next was even more shocking. For a split second, everything stood still. The wind cut through the cemetery, rustling the trees, but no one heard it. Every eye was on the gun, Reeves's gun, aimed squarely at General Carter's chest. A collective breath held. Then, chaos. Gasps, shouts, someone screamed. A woman clutched her child and pulled them back. Officers near the podium reacted instantly, their hands flying to their holsters. A few civilians ducked behind headstones, instinctively seeking cover even though no shot had been fired. But Carter, she didn't flinch. Her back was still straight, her eyes locked onto Reeves. Decades of combat training had burned fear out of her. The battlefield had taught her to assess, not to panic. If this was going to be her last moment, she'd face it head-on. But it wasn't just her life at stake. The crowd, her people, were behind her. Soldiers, officers, families. If Reeves pulled that trigger, he wouldn't just be shooting a general. He'd be committing an execution in front of an entire funeral of military personnel. Yet his hand didn't waver. His eyes burned with something wild, something unhinged. "You don't belong here," Reeves muttered, his voice barely audible over the rising panic. Carter slowly took a step forward, her hands steady at her sides. "Sergeant, put the weapon down." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Reeves's grip tightened. His knuckles whitened around the handle. His breathing was ragged now, his chest rising and falling like a man possessed. Another voice broke through the air. Colonel James Whitmore standing at Carter's side. "Reeves, think about what you're doing," he barked, his own hand hovering over his holstered sidearm. "This is a funeral. Put the gun down." But Reeves didn't budge. His finger hovered over the trigger. In that moment, the cemetery became a battlefield. No gunfire, no bombs, but the same thin line between life and death. The wrong movement, the wrong word, and it was over. A military officer in the front row, Captain Daniel Ruiz, made a subtle move, shifting his stance. Reeves's head snapped toward him. "Wrong move." "Stay the hell back," Reeves barked, his hand shaking now. His voice cracked, a sign of uncertainty. And that's when it happened. The break in his focus, the split second of hesitation, enough. Ruiz lunged. In one swift motion he grabbed Reeves' wrist, forcing the gun upward. A shot fired into the sky, bang! The sound tearing through the cemetery. Screams erupted, people hit the ground. But Ruiz held on. Reeves fought back, swinging wildly, trying to regain control of his weapon. The struggle was violent, a blur of fists and twisting limbs. Reeves was strong, but Ruiz had military training on his side. More officers jumped in, a full-on takedown. 4 men wrestled Reeves to the ground, slamming him against the wet grass. His gun was ripped from his grasp and kicked away. He screamed, thrashing beneath the weight of multiple officers. "Get off me! She doesn't belong here. This is ours." His voice was raw, desperate. But it was over. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Someone pressed a knee into his back, securing him. Officers and soldiers pulled themselves up, breathing hard. And General Carter, still standing. The gunshot had torn through the funeral's silence. But she hadn't moved, and cowered. Hadn't looked away. For a long moment she simply stared at Reeves, watching him as he thrashed on the ground, ranting like a man unhinged. Then she turned, stepping back toward the podium. The flag-draped casket was still there. Colonel Benjamin Strauss still deserved his tribute. She adjusted her uniform, dusted off her sleeve, and lifted the microphone again. But the funeral would never be the same. And what happened next would shake the entire nation. The silence after the gunshot was deafening. The air was thick with fear, but the only sound came from Reeves, panting like a cornered animal. His cheek pressed into the damp grass as officers pinned him down. His body twisted against their grip, but he wasn't going anywhere. People were still crouched behind tombstones, gripping the cold stone for protection they no longer needed. Others slowly rose to their feet, shaken but unharmed. The reality of what had just happened settled over them like a dense fog. They had come to mourn a soldier, not to witness an act of terror. An elderly woman clutched her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. A young cadet in uniform stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. A mother shielded her son, her hands shaking as she whispered reassurances neither of them believed. And at the center of it all was General Olivia Carter. She hadn't moved from the podium. Not when the gun had been pointed at her. Not when the shot had rung out. Not when the world had erupted into chaos. Her grip on the microphone was steady, her posture unshaken, but something shifted in her eyes, not fear, not anger, but something colder, something resolute. Reeves's muffled voice broke through the stunned silence. "This isn't your place," he spat, his words laced with fury, desperation, something deeply broken. "You don't belong here. None of you do." The officers restraining him didn't acknowledge the outburst. They worked methodically, one securing his wrists, another searching him for additional weapons. But Carter heard every word. She finally turned toward him, a gaze like stone. Decades of military service had taught her to recognize a man who was already lost. A sudden movement near the crowd. Two military officers, Colonel Whitmore and Captain Ruiz, approached the scene, their faces grim. "Get him out of here," Whitmore ordered, his voice low, firm. The officers on top of Reeves didn't hesitate. They hauled him up, gripping each of his arms tightly as they dragged him toward the nearest squad car. His feet barely touched the ground, but he wasn't done. Reeves twisted his head, locking eyes with Carter one last time. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You hear me? This isn't over." Carter didn't blink. She didn't answer, because for her, it was already over. The only thing left was the fallout. News spread fast. By the time Reeves was thrown into the back of the police cruiser, reporters were already setting up cameras outside the cemetery gates. Military police worked to restore order, assuring the shaken attendees that the threat had passed. But the funeral, it would never regain the dignity it deserved. The honor guard hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Should they continue? Should they wait? Then Carter's voice cut through the thick, tense air. "Proceed." It wasn't a request. It was a command. One by one the soldiers returned to position. Rifles were raised. A crisp, practiced stillness settled over them. 3 sharp volleys of gunfire pierced the sky, echoing across the cemetery, reclaiming the silence Reeves had tried to steal. But there was no mistaking it. This funeral wasn't just about Colonel Strauss anymore. It was about everything that had happened here today, and the whole country was about to hear about it. By nightfall, the story was everywhere. Sergeant arrested after pointing gun at military general during funeral. Chaos at Arlington, white officer pulls gun on black general. Attempted assassination or hate-fueled outburst, the case of Officer Daniel Reeves. Cable news ran the footage on a loop, grainy cell phone videos captured from multiple angles. The moment Reeves unholstered his weapon, the way he pushed through the crowd, the brief second before he pulled the trigger, the gunshot that shattered the silence. Every outlet was scrambling for new details. Who was Reeves? What drove him to do it? Was it premeditated, or had he snapped in the moment? The answer wasn't simple. His history surfaced almost immediately. Daniel Reeves, 43 years old, a 15-year veteran of the Fairfax County Police Department. On paper, a decorated officer with commendations for bravery. But dig deeper, and a different story emerged. There were complaints. A lot of them. Excessive force, racial profiling, incidents where body cam footage conveniently disappeared. Yet he had never faced real consequences. Internal reviews, paid leave, cases closed quietly. Until now. The public outcry was instant. Military officials, civil rights groups, and even law enforcement agencies demanded justice. The case moved fast, faster than anyone expected. Within a week, Reeves was indicted on multiple charges: attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, terroristic threats, hate crime enhancements. The prosecution built their case around one key point. Reeves wasn't just a cop with a gun. He was a man in uniform who had abused his power, fueled by prejudice, and tried to execute a military general in broad daylight. When the trial began, the whole country watched. The courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia was packed. The gallery was filled with military officers, veterans, activists, and the media. A row of uniformed men and women sat behind General Carter, their presence a silent show of unity. Reeves sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his suit stiff. Gone was the arrogance from the cemetery. He was a man cornered. The prosecution's opening statement was brutal. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a man, entrusted with a badge and a gun, who used his authority to try and take the life of a woman who had given her life to this country. Then came the witnesses. First, the funeral attendees, the grieving families, the young cadets who had watched in horror. Then, Colonel James Whitmore, the man who had stood beside Carter. His voice was steady as he recalled the moment Reeves raised his weapon. "I knew right then that if we hadn't acted fast, General Carter would be dead." The most damning testimony came from Captain Daniel Ruiz, the man who tackled Reeves. "I saw his eyes. He wasn't scared. He wasn't confused. He was determined. That's what scared me the most." The prosecution played the footage from the funeral, freezing the frame at the exact moment Reeves took aim. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Then they pulled out his disciplinary record. The jury saw everything: the years of red flags, the complaints that had been brushed aside, the patterns of escalating behavior. Reeves's defense team scrambled. They tried to spin it, said he was under stress, on edge from recent crime rates, caught up in the moment. But the evidence was too damning, and the prosecution had one final blow. They played Reeves's interrogation tape. The courtroom listened as he was asked why he did it. His voice, recorded and undeniable, rang through the speakers. "She doesn't belong here. Not in that uniform, not in that position, this country." He stopped himself, but it was too late. His own words had sealed his fate. And when the verdict came, it made history. The jury only deliberated for 3 hours. That was all it took. The courtroom was packed. Military officers in uniform, families clutching each other's hands, reporters with their notepads at the ready. Reeves sat at the defense table, his face blank, but his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His attorney leaned in, whispering something to him, but he didn't react. Then, the judge returned. The bailiff called for order. And then the foreman stood. "On the charge of attempted murder, how does the jury find the defendant?" "Guilty." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon?" "Guilty." "On the charge of terroristic threats?" "Guilty." "On the charge of hate crime enhancements?" The foreman took a breath. "Guilty." The room exploded, gasping, whispers, a few stifled cries of relief. The weight of it all settled in. Reeves sat motionless, his face draining of color. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off, his jaw tightening. But the moment everyone had been waiting for came next: the sentencing. Judge Robert Langley, an ex-military man himself, didn't waste words. He looked directly at Reeves. "Mr. Reeves, you spent 15 years as an officer of the law. The responsibility of that badge was not only to protect, but to uphold justice. Instead, you used it as a shield for your own prejudice, believing your authority placed you above consequences." Reeves didn't blink. The judge continued. "You aimed a gun at an unarmed woman at her funeral, a woman who has dedicated her life to this country, a woman who outranks you in every sense of the word. You tried to kill her in front of dozens of witnesses, and the only explanation you could give was that she didn't belong." A heavy pause. "Well, Mr. Reeves, you don't belong outside of a prison cell." The gallery held its breath. Then the gavel hit. "I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The room erupted. Reporters scrambling for their phones, families gasping, military officers exchanging solemn nods. Reeves's face finally cracked. His mouth opened slightly, his breathing quickened, but the guards were already pulling him up from his chair. The last image of him wasn't a defiant man shouting injustice. It was a man being dragged out of the courtroom, head down, handcuffed, defeated, and General Olivia Carter just watched. No celebration, no satisfaction, just a quiet, firm acceptance that justice had been served. But the impact of this case didn't stop in that courtroom. The case was over. But the shockwaves it sent through the country were just beginning. Within hours of the sentencing, news outlets across the nation ran the story nonstop. Historic verdict. Ex-cop, sentenced to life without parole for attempted murder of military general. A badge doesn't make you untouchable. What the Reeves case means for law enforcement. A military general stared down a gun, and won. The footage from the courtroom. Reeves's stunned expression as the verdict was read, the judge's scathing rebuke, the moment he was led away in handcuffs, became one of the most replayed clips on TV. But the real discussion wasn't about the trial itself. It was about what it represented. The backlash against Reeves's actions didn't just come from activists or civil rights groups. It came from law enforcement itself. For the first time in years, police unions didn't rush to defend one of their own. "We cannot support officers who use their power to fuel personal hatred," the Fairfax County Police Department said in a statement. Other departments issued similar responses, some going further by re-evaluating their policies on officer misconduct. Even politicians weighed in. A bipartisan bill was introduced in Congress proposing stricter background checks for officers and harsher penalties for those found guilty of racial bias in the line of duty. Military leaders released statements condemning what had happened at Arlington. But perhaps the biggest change came from ordinary citizens. People who once refused to believe that bias could exist in law enforcement were now forced to confront the evidence. Reeves wasn't just a rogue cop. He was the product of a system that let him slide for years. And this time, that system had finally failed to protect him. Through it all, General Olivia Carter remained silent. No interviews, no press conferences, no political statements. She let the world talk. But 2 weeks after the trial, she finally spoke publicly. Not to a news anchor, but to the soldiers under her command. At a military base in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, she stood before a room of cadets, young men and women just beginning their journey in service. Her speech wasn't about herself. It was about them. "Some of you may look at me and wonder how I stood there without fear," she said. "Some of you may think it was strength. Maybe it was courage. Maybe it was defiance." She paused. "But the truth is simpler than that. I stood there because I knew something Daniel Reeves didn't understand. Power is not given through a gun. It is not given through a badge. It is not given through a uniform. True power is in how you choose to carry yourself, how you serve others, how you stand for something greater than yourself." She looked around the room. "The moment you forget that, you're no different from him." Silence. Then, applause. Not loud, not celebratory, just firm, steady, meaningful. Because those cadets understood. They understood that this case wasn't just about one officer losing control. It was about what happens when the wrong people are given power. And how, this time, justice didn't fail. The story of Daniel Reeves will be remembered for what it exposed. The story of General Olivia Carter will be remembered for what it proved. And in the end, the lesson was clear. A badge doesn't make you right. A gun doesn't make you powerful. And justice, when done right, doesn't care what uniform you wear. If you believe in standing up against injustice, subscribe for more stories that need to be told.